night air hung heavy with the scent of rain and dust, the kind that always came before a storm on the edge of the desert. The last of the sun had slipped behind the red hills, leaving the small frontier village wrapped in the dim orange haze of dying light. Lanterns flickered in the windows of wooden cabins, and the only sound was the faint creak of the old windmill turning above the well. People had already gone inside, locking doors and shuttering windows, for they knew what the wilderness could hide once the dark took over. Coyotes, outlaws, or worse, those who carried the blood of the Apache and the hatred of loss. Down the lonely trail that led from the canyon, a woman staggered forward barefoot, her skin marked with dust, her dark hair tangled by the wind. Her breath came hard and shallow, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She had been running for days, hunted, beaten by the desert, driven by something stronger than pain, the need to live. Her tattered dress clung to her body, torn by thorns and rocks, and her eyes, wild and burning, searched the horizon for any sign of refuge. In the distance, the glow of the settlement shimmered faintly like a promise. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys, and the faint sounds of laughter drifted from the saloon before the doors shut tight. She stopped for a moment, clutching her side, feeling the weight of her heart pound in her chest. Behind her, the land stretched endless and cruel. Dry mesas and coyote trails where her people once roamed free. But those days were gone. The cavalry had swept through months ago, leaving ashes and silence. She had survived when others had not. She had escaped when chains tried to hold her. But freedom was a fragile thing when the whole world saw you as a fugitive. She reached the edge of the village, just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The streets were empty. A stray dog barked once, then vanished into the dark. Her bare feet splashed through the mud as she looked for shelter. A light still burned in a stable at the far end, and she could hear the steady rhythm of a horse being brushed. She moved closer, cautious, her heart trembling with both hope and dread. Inside, a man worked in silence. He was tall, shoulders broad from years of hard labor, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. His horse shifted in the stall, ears flicking as he hummed a tune low under his breath. The sound stopped when the door creaked open, and his hand went straight to the rifle leaning by the wall. The woman froze in the doorway, rain dripping from her hair, eyes wide with fear. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her, the dirt, the bruises, the blood that traced a line down her arm. "You're far from where you belong," he said quietly, his voice rough from years of dust and whiskey. "I have nowhere," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Nowhere to go." He frowned, lowering the rifle but not the caution in his eyes. "You one of them that came down from the mountains?" She nodded slowly. "They killed my people. I ran. They said I was one of the ones who escaped." He let out a long breath and rubbed his jaw, the storm rumbling closer. "You can't stay here. Folks round here don't take kindly to your kind. They'll hang you just for stepping into town." She stepped forward, desperation shaking her voice. "Please, I can work. I can wash your feet. I can be your mate. I can give you offspring. Just let me live." The words hung in the air, strange and raw, carried by the sound of thunder rolling over the hills. He stared at her like he wasn't sure he'd heard right. The storm wind blew the door open wider, and for a heartbeat the lightning lit her face. Haunted. Beautiful in a way only suffering could carve. He looked away, muttering under his breath, "You don't know what you're saying." But she did. Every word came from a place deeper than pride. The Apache woman had lost everything. Her tribe, her family, her name. The world she knew had burned, and all she had left was her will to survive. In her mind, the man before her was no stranger. He was a gate between life and death. He set the rifle aside but didn't step closer. "You stay the night in the hayloft. Come morning, you go. If they see you here, there's no saving either of us." She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." He watched her climb the ladder to the loft, every move slow from exhaustion. When she disappeared into the shadows, he sighed and sat down, running a hand through his hair. Outside, the rain came harder, tapping against the tin roof like the sound of distant hoofbeats. The night deepened. The wind howled through the cracks of the stable, carrying with it the faint echo of drums. Perhaps only the memory of them. The man couldn't sleep. Something about her voice, that raw mix of fear and fire, stayed in his mind. She was more than just a runaway. There was a story behind those eyes, something he couldn't name but couldn't turn away from either. Up in the loft, she lay awake too. The smell of hay and horses surrounded her, the warmth of safety fragile and unfamiliar. She listened to the storm, to the restless stamping of the animals and to her own heartbeat pounding like a warning. In her dreams she saw the fires of her village, the soldiers' boots, the sound of children crying. She pressed her hand to her chest and whispered words in her own tongue, prayers to ancestors long gone. Sometime before dawn, she heard voices outside, male voices, rough and close. She crept to the edge of the loft, peering through the cracks. Lanterns flickered outside the stable door, shadows moving across the wet ground. "You seen anyone come through here?" one of them called. "Tracks lead this way. We think the Apache's hiding in town." The man stepped out, his voice steady. "Ain't seen a soul since sundown." The lantern light glowed across his weathered face. The men looked at each other, suspicious. "You'd better not be lying, friend. There's a bounty on her head. Orders say she's to be brought in alive, or dead if she runs." She held her breath, her hands trembling as she watched from above. One wrong move and they'd find her. The man stood still, his jaw tightening. "You got my word," he said finally. "Ain't no Apache woman here." After a long silence, the riders turned away, the sound of hooves fading into the rain. He stayed standing in the doorway long after they were gone, his eyes scanning the night. When he turned back inside, their eyes met, his filled with quiet resolve, hers with disbelief and gratitude. Neither spoke. Words weren't needed. The storm was easing, but both knew it wasn't over. Outside, dawn crept slow and pale across the sky, painting the mud road in thin streaks of gold. Smoke began to rise from the chimneys again, and the village slowly stirred awake. Somewhere in the distance, the cry of a hawk echoed across the canyon, sharp and lonely. The man poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands steady though his heart wasn't. He looked up at the loft, knowing what would come next. The day would bring questions, danger, and choices he wasn't ready for. And in the loft, the Apache woman watched him silently, knowing she could no longer run. The world outside wanted her dead. Inside that stable, she had found something she hadn't expected. Kindness. But kindness had a cost. And as the sun broke over the red horizon, both of them knew that the cost would soon come calling. Morning light broke over the valley, slow and cold, washing the small settlement in a dull gold glow. The smell of wet earth filled the air after the night's rain, and smoke curled from the chimneys as the townsfolk stirred from their beds. The man stepped outside the stable, his boots sinking in the mud, his mind heavy with what he'd done. He had lied to the riders, lied for a stranger, an Apache woman no less. That alone could be enough to hang him if word ever spread. But something in her eyes last night had made it impossible to hand her over. Maybe pity, maybe something else he couldn't name. He walked down to the trough, splashed cold water on his face, and looked toward the ridge beyond the village where the clouds still lingered. He'd lived in this land long enough to know what it cost to trust anyone. Since the war ended, the country had been crawling with broken men trying to start over. Farmers, deserters, wanderers, and killers who called themselves lawmen. The territory was rough, justice was thin, and mercy was often a thing found only in the church sermons on Sunday. He turned when he heard the faint sound of movement behind him. The woman had come down from the loft. Her hair was still damp, her face pale but calmer than last night. She wore a torn blanket over her shoulders that she must have found among the hay, her feet bare and covered in straw. For a moment, neither spoke. "You should eat something," he said finally, handing her a piece of cornbread from the shelf. She took it slowly, her hands trembling, then nodded in quiet thanks. "I can leave," she said, her voice low but firm. "If they find me here, they'll hurt you." He shook his head. "Not yet. Trails are too wet, and those men will be riding the area for days. You step outside that gate, they'll see your tracks before the sun's down." She hesitated, her dark eyes searching his face. "Why did you lie for me?" He didn't answer right away. He looked past her at the slow-moving clouds, at the outline of the church steeple in the distance. "Because I've seen enough dying," he said finally. "And you don't deserve to be hunted like an animal." Her eyes softened, though suspicion still lingered in them. Trust was something she hadn't known for a long time. As the day stretched on, the town came alive. Wagons creaked down the main street, children ran barefoot through puddles, and the blacksmith's hammer rang steady and sharp. But in the stable, the air stayed tense. The man went about his chores quietly, while she sat in the corner mending a torn piece of cloth with a small bone needle she carried in a pouch. Every noise from outside, the bark of a dog, the sound of boots in the mud made her flinch. When he noticed, he said, "You don't have to look over your shoulder here." "Not yet." She gave a faint, tired smile. In my land, we were taught that safety is a lie. The moment you believe you're safe, death finds you. He paused, leaning on the handle of his pitchfork. Your land, tell me about it. Her eyes drifted toward the far horizon, where the mesas rose red against the fading clouds. It was beyond the river. High ground, soft wind. My people called it Nokaya, the place where the sky meets the sand. We lived there for many generations before the soldiers came. They said the land wasn't ours anymore. They burned our lodges and took the young ones away. I was among those who ran. I've been running since. He nodded slowly, saying nothing. He had seen the same story before, though told from different mouths. The war between settlers and the Apache had left scars on both sides. But hearing it from her, seeing the weight in her eyes, made it more real than any newspaper story ever could. As the hours passed, a fragile rhythm settled between them. She helped him with the horses, gentle in her movements, whispering to the animals in a language he didn't understand. They responded to her touch like they sensed her pain. The stable felt different when she was near, quieter, like the air itself was holding its breath. By afternoon, he saw riders again on the far ridge. The same ones from last night. They weren't looking for stray cattle this time. They were searching. He tensed, stepping back inside the stable. They're still out there, he muttered. She froze, her hands gripping the wooden rail. They won't stop, she whispered. One of them used to come to our camp before the war. He wore blue once, but now he hunts for gold. They told him I killed a man. Did you? He asked quietly. Her eyes met his, steady and full of something that wasn't guilt. I defended my brother. They came to take him. I didn't let them. He looked down, understanding more than he wanted to admit. Out here, everyone carried ghosts. As dusk approached, he lit a lantern and closed the stable doors. You'll have to stay one more night, he said. Tomorrow, if the rain holds off, I'll find a way to get you across the river. She hesitated. Why risk yourself? He looked at her with weary eyes. Because no one ever did the same for me. The wind picked up again, rattling the boards. He handed her a blanket and gestured toward the loft. She climbed up, her movement slow but graceful, her presence like a shadow slipping between worlds. He stayed below, sitting by the lantern, lost in thoughts that had no clear end. Memories of another time crept in. The war, the burning of towns, the sound of men crying for mercy. He'd done things then that still haunted him. Maybe helping her was his way of paying some debt to the past. Maybe it was something deeper, something he didn't dare name. Outside, thunder rumbled once more, though the storm was far off now. He could hear the coyotes calling in the distance, their cries long and lonesome. Up in the loft, the Apache woman watched him through the cracks, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. She knew this safety wouldn't last. She had seen kindness before, and she knew how quickly it could turn to fear once others found out. She whispered softly to herself, a prayer to the spirits. Let him not suffer for me. When dawn came, it brought with it the smell of smoke, not from chimneys, but from the hills. The man stepped outside and saw the faint dark plume rising beyond the ridge. The riders were closer now, sweeping through the canyons. They'd burn brush, smoke out any hiding place, track her to the ends of the valley if they had to. He went back into the stable fast. You've got to move, he said. They're coming this way. She looked at him, startled. Where will I go? He grabbed a saddlebag, stuffing it with bread jerky and a small flask. There's an old trail behind the ridge that leads to the dry creek bed. Follow it until you reach the river. If you keep east, you'll find the Navajo traders by sundown. She took the bag, but her hands shook. If they see me leave, they'll kill you. He gave a faint smile. Then I'll make sure they don't. She opened her mouth to argue, but he shook his head. No more talking, go. For a moment, neither moved. The air between them was heavy with unspoken things, fear, gratitude, something like sorrow. She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face as if trying to remember it. If I live, she whispered, I'll remember what you did. Then she turned and slipped out the back door, vanishing into the thin morning mist. He watched her go, heart hammering, before stepping outside to face whatever would come. The riders were already visible on the ridge, 3 of them, rifles across their saddles. He walked toward them slowly, keeping his movements calm. Morning, he called. Morning, the lead rider said, eyes narrow. You see anything strange out here? Tracks maybe. He shook his head. Only my own. The rider dismounted, scanning the ground. His boots pressed into the wet earth, close to where her bare footprints had been. The man's pulse raced, but he kept his face still. Funny thing, the rider said, kneeling down. These prints here look small. Woman size, fresh. Could be one of the townsfolk, he said evenly. Had a visitor this morning. Left before sunrise. The rider stood slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. If you're hiding her, it won't go well for you. The man met his gaze. If I were hiding anyone, you'd already know. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind carried the smell of rain and wood smoke between them. Finally, the rider spat in the mud and swung back into his saddle. You see her again, you send word. There's $50 in it for whoever brings her in. They turned and rode off toward the ridge. The man stood still until their shapes disappeared into the haze, then exhaled slowly, his body trembling from the strain. He turned back toward the stable, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of her. There was none, just the vast empty land stretching toward the rising sun. He didn't know if she would make it. He didn't even know if he'd see her again. But deep down, something told him their paths weren't finished crossing. The story between them was only beginning, and somewhere beyond the hills, fate was already waiting for its turn to speak. The day dragged on with the weight of thunder in the air, even though the sky was clear. The man worked the field near the barn, but his mind wasn't on the soil. Every sound from the hills made him glance up. He half expected to see her shadow moving across the ridge or a horseman carrying her body back-tied across the saddle. He tried to push the thought away, but it clung to him like sweat on his back. By noon, the riders had returned to town. He could see their shapes from a distance, gathered by the saloon, their laughter cutting through the still air like knives. They were drinking, but their horses were still saddled, meaning they hadn't given up the hunt. That troubled him most. A man with whiskey in his hand but his rifle still strapped tight was a man not ready to stop looking. Inside the saloon, talk had already started spreading. Someone claimed a stranger had seen smoke out by the riverbed. Another swore he found fresh footprints near the canyon pass. Word spread fast in small towns, and faster when a bounty was on the wind. $50 could buy a new horse, a winter's food, or a clean start somewhere east. The man tried to stay out of it, but when he walked into the general store that evening, all eyes turned his way. The owner, a gray-haired widow who ran the place with her boy, gave him a careful look. You hear about that Apache fugitive? She asked. They say she's close, he nodded slightly. I heard. She's dangerous, they say. One of the soldiers said she slit a man's throat up in the canyon. People say a lot of things when they're scared, he replied, setting a small sack of flour on the counter. She studied him for a moment, then handed him his change. If she comes this way, you best not get involved, you hear? Those men mean business. He only nodded again, but something in his chest tightened. Outside, he could hear the sound of boots on the boardwalk and the snort of horses. He turned and saw the lead rider from before, the one with the sharp eyes and the gray hat, watching him from across the street. Their gazes met for a second too long. Then the rider smiled, slow and cold. When night came, he didn't sleep. The air was too still, the kind of stillness that hides danger. He sat by the window of his cabin, lamp turned low, and listened to the coyotes calling far away. He wondered where she was now, if she'd found the river, if she'd made it to safety. But a part of him didn't believe she'd left the valley. There was something stubborn in her eyes, the kind that didn't surrender to fate. He was right. Miles away, the Apache woman crouched in the dry creek bed, her body wrapped in the same torn blanket. The river she'd been told to follow had run low, barely a trickle, and she had been walking for hours with nothing but thirst to keep her moving. Her feet were bleeding again, and the bag he'd given her was nearly empty. But worse than the hunger was the sound she'd been hearing since sunset, the slow rhythm of a single horse moving somewhere behind her. She knew that rhythm. She'd heard it before. When she finally stopped, she pressed herself against the rocks and waited. The wind carried the faint jingle of spurs, then the low grunt of a man's voice. He was close. She reached for a sharp stone and gripped it tight. She had no gun, no knife, only instinct. The rider appeared on the ridge, the gray hat barely visible against the fading light. He looked down into the creek bed, scanning. Then he dismounted, her pulse hammered. She crawled low through the brush, keeping her body against the dirt. The man stepped closer, kicking through the dry weeds, his boots crunching the soil. When he reached the edge of the creek, she moved fast, hurling the stone at him. It struck his shoulder, making him curse, but before she could run, his hand grabbed her by the arm and yanked her down hard. There you are, he hissed, dragging her toward him. Been chasing your ghost for 2 days. She struggled, kicking, but he was stronger. His grip was like iron, his breath thick with whiskey. You thought you could hide, didn't you? He snarled. They said you killed one of ours. Maybe I'll take you in alive, maybe I won't. Before he could tighten his hold, a sound cracked through the silence, a rifle shot, sharp and clean. The bullet struck the dirt inches from his boot. He spun around, eyes wide, searching for where it came from. Up on the ridge, the man stood with his rifle leveled, smoke rising from the barrel. Let her go, he said quietly. The rider cursed under his breath. You again. He drew his pistol, but the man fired first, the shot whistling past his hand. The gun fell to the ground. Next one won't miss, the man warned. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind. Then slowly the rider stepped back, glaring. You just bought yourself a death sentence, friend. He mounted his horse and galloped off toward the valley, dust trailing behind him. The man climbed down from the ridge, his rifle slung over his shoulder. When he reached her, she was still shaking, half expecting another shot to come from behind. He knelt beside her, his voice steady. You're bleeding. She looked up at him, eyes full of disbelief. You followed me. I had a feeling you'd find trouble. He helped her stand, supporting her weight. We can't stay here. He'll bring the others. They moved quickly through the darkness, keeping to the dry gullies. By the time the moon rose, they had reached a grove of cottonwoods by the river. He built a small fire and wrapped her feet in strips of cloth torn from his shirt. She watched him in silence, her eyes reflecting the flames. You risked your life again, she said softly. Why? He didn't answer right away. Because I don't believe every life should be decided by someone else's law. She looked away, her throat tightening. In my tribe we had a saying, the land remembers kindness longer than man does. He smiled faintly. Then I hope the land's got a long memory. But even as they spoke, danger was moving closer. Back in town, the rider had returned with anger burning in his eyes. He gathered 2 others, and by dawn they were saddled and ready. The townsfolk didn't ask questions. They just watched. Everyone knew what happened to those who crossed bounty men. Meanwhile, the man and the Apache woman rested by the river. He told her about his past, the war, the things he'd done, how he'd lost his wife to fever and never found a reason to leave the valley. She listened quietly, sometimes meeting his gaze, sometimes turning away when pain flickered through her eyes. You could start over, she said, somewhere far from here. Maybe, he said. But running never fixed much. She gave a faint smile. You sound like one of my elders. He used to say the same before they killed him. The wind picked up again, carrying the smell of smoke and horses. He froze. They found us, he whispered. He doused the fire with his boot and pulled her behind the rocks. 3 riders were coming along the riverbank, rifles across their saddles. He checked his bullets. Only 4 left. Not enough. They'll kill you, she said. I'll draw them away. Not a chance, he muttered. The riders slowed as they neared the grove. One called out, You can't hide her forever. You know what happens to those who protect their kind. The man's hand tightened on his rifle. His voice was calm, but his heart pounded. You step 1 foot closer, you'll find out what happens to those who threaten me. The leader laughed, his tone cruel. You think you can save her? She's a savage. You're a fool. Before he could finish, a shot rang out, not from the man, but from somewhere behind the riders. One of them fell from his horse, clutching his leg. Confusion spread like wildfire. The man looked to his left and saw, just for an instant, a figure on the ridge. A shadow with a rifle, moving with skill and silence. The remaining riders panicked, retreating toward the town. The man and the woman stayed hidden until the sound of hooves faded. When it was quiet again, she looked at him, breathless. Who fired? He shook his head. I don't know. Maybe someone else who doesn't believe the law's always right. But deep down, he wasn't sure it was help. He'd heard stories before. Mercenaries who hunted both sides for gold. Men who shot not to save but to corner. The silence that followed felt heavy, uncertain. They sat by the dying river, both knowing this was only a pause, not safety. She reached for his hand, her voice low. They won't stop now. You could still leave me. He looked at her, his jaw tight. I won't. Above them, thunder rolled again in the distance, though the sky was clear. Somewhere out there, fate was moving, unseen and unstoppable. The man and the Apache fugitive waited in the shadow of the cottonwoods. 2 souls caught between mercy and survival, not knowing that the next dawn would change everything. The wind carried a strange quiet through the canyon that night. The man and the Apache woman sat by what was left of the fire, both staring at the embers that glowed like dying stars. The sound of the river trickling nearby was the only sign of life. but even that felt uneasy, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The man's eyes kept shifting toward the dark ridge across the valley. Whoever had fired that mysterious shot earlier was still out there, watching, waiting. He could feel it like a weight pressing on his chest. The woman sat close but silent. Her face was turned toward the darkness, her thoughts far away. The light of the fire showed the cut across her cheek, the dirt still clinging to her skin, and the strength in her eyes that refused to fade. She had been through hell, yet she still looked ready to fight the world again if she had to. The man knew that kind of spirit. It was born from loss and tempered by fire. He rose slowly, walking to the edge of the camp, scanning the ridge. His rifle hung from his shoulder, his hand never far from the grip. The moon had risen higher, throwing long, pale shadows over the rocks. Somewhere in the distance an owl called. He knew the riders would return soon. Men like that didn't forgive being made fools of. They'd bring more guns, maybe the sheriff, maybe worse. Behind him, the woman's voice broke the silence. "You think they'll come tonight?" He didn't turn. "If they don't, they'll come at dawn." She stood and walked to him, her steps quiet. "Then we can't stay here," he sighed. "No, but we can't outrun them either. The horses are too close to the town, and the trails are being watched. The only way out is through the canyon pass, but that's a death road after dark." Her eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon. Death road is better than waiting to die. He looked at her then, seeing the fire in her face, the same spark that had kept her alive this long. "You've got more fight in you than half the soldiers I knew," he said. "I had to," she replied. "When you lose everything, fear becomes useless." The man nodded slowly, then began packing what little they had left. His movements were quick, efficient. The blanket, the canteen, the small sack of food. She watched him for a moment before kneeling to smother the fire with sand. When the last ember went dark, they were swallowed by the sound of the night. They moved quietly through the brush, keeping close to the river's edge. The moonlight was just enough to see by, but every few steps he glanced over his shoulder. The feeling of being followed grew stronger, like unseen eyes in the dark. Once he thought he heard the creak of a saddle far off. Another time, a faint metallic click like a rifle bolt being drawn back. He stopped each time, heart hammering, but saw nothing. After an hour, the canyon narrowed, the cliffs closing in around them. The trail curved sharply, leading to the pass that cut through the red rock. It was a place known to outlaws and hunters alike, a place where the echoes carried too far, and the moonlight could vanish in a blink. As they entered the pass, the air grew colder. The woman's breathing was steady but quiet. Her bare feet left light tracks in the dust, and he did his best to step over them to hide her trail. The rocks towered on both sides, high and jagged, casting long shadows that moved with every gust of wind. Halfway through, the man raised a hand. "Stop!" She froze instantly. He tilted his head, listening. There was a sound ahead, faint but unmistakable, the soft whicker of a horse. Then another. He crouched, pulling her down beside him. "They're here," he whispered. Her eyes darted to the ridge above them. "How many?" He shook his head. "Can't tell." "But they're waiting on both sides." The woman's jaw tightened. "We can't turn back." He knew she was right. Going back meant running straight into the ones behind them. He studied the walls of the canyon, his mind racing. There was a narrow ledge up to the right, barely wide enough to crawl across. It led to an outcrop that overlooked the pass. From there, maybe, they could slip past while the men below waited for them to walk into the trap. He motioned toward it. "Climb up there. I'll follow." She looked at the ledge, then at him. "It's too high. Not for you," he said firmly. "Go," she didn't argue. She began climbing, fingers gripping the rough rock, her movements sure and silent. When she reached halfway, he followed, the weight of the rifle slowing him. The stones shifted under his boots, sending small pebbles tumbling down. Below, a voice shouted, "You hear that?" The man froze, pressing himself against the rock. Another voice answered, "Up there. Check the ridge." He motioned for her to keep moving. She crawled the last few feet and pulled herself onto the ledge. He followed, heart pounding as a shot echoed below them. The bullet sparked against the rock near his shoulder. "Run," he hissed. They scrambled along the narrow ledge, rocks cutting into their palms, gunfire cracking from below. Dust filled the air, stinging their eyes. The man fired once into the darkness, not to hit, but to slow them down. The echo roared through the canyon, masking their footsteps as they reached the far end of the ledge and ducked behind a cluster of boulders. The shooting stopped after a moment, replaced by the sound of distant shouting. The riders were spreading out, trying to find another way up. The man reloaded quietly, his hands trembling slightly from adrenaline. She leaned against the stone beside him, breathing hard. "They won't stop, I know," he said. "But if we can reach the ridgeline before dawn, we can lose them in the high country." They rested only long enough to catch their breath before moving again. The climb grew steeper, the path twisting upward through sharp rocks. The air was thinner here, and the wind howled like a living thing. When they finally reached the ridge, the valley spread out below them, dark and endless. But there, far to the south, a faint orange glow shimmered, the lights of another settlement, maybe a trading post, maybe safety. She followed his gaze. "How far?" "Half a day if we move fast," he said. But before they could take another step, a rifle cracked from below. The bullet struck the rock beside her, splintering it into dust. She stumbled, and he caught her, pulling her behind cover. The echo rolled across the cliffs. "They've found us again," he muttered. Voices rose from the canyon, closer now. The men were climbing, their lanterns flickering like ghosts below. The man turned to her, eyes fierce. "You keep going. Don't stop no matter what you hear." She shook her head, gripping his arm. "I won't leave you." "You have to," he said. "If they catch both of us, it's over. Someone has to make it." She looked at him for a long, painful moment. "You saved me twice. I won't repay that with running." Before he could answer, another shot tore through the air, this one grazing his shoulder. He fell to one knee, gritting his teeth as blood soaked through his shirt. She dropped beside him, pressing her hand against the wound. "Keep pressure on it," he gasped. "Don't let me slow you down," but she refused to move. Her eyes burned in the moonlight, full of fire and defiance. "If I die here, I die free. But not alone." He looked at her, something breaking inside him. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade. The gunfire, the shouting, the danger. All that remained was the sound of their breathing and the wind over the ridge. Then a lantern light appeared above them. The riders had reached the upper trail. The leader's voice carried over the rocks. "You can't run forever. Give her up and maybe we'll let you live." The man stood slowly, blood running down his arm, his rifle steady. His voice was calm but cold as steel. "You want her, you come through me." The woman stood beside him, her face fierce and unyielding. Together they faced the flickering lights moving closer, the night heavy with tension. The canyon echoed with the sound of boots, the scrape of metal, the whisper of fear. Somewhere deep in the dark, thunder rolled again, low, distant, like the growl of something ancient waiting to wake. The man tightened his grip on the rifle. The Apache woman reached for a rock, ready to fight with her bare hands if she had to. The first shadow stepped into the moonlight, then another. The man raised his weapon slowly, eyes hard. "Get ready," he whispered. The woman nodded once. The next breath would decide everything. The world hung silent, caught between light and death, between mercy and vengeance, just a heartbeat away from the breaking point. The first light of dawn broke soft and cold across the ridge, painting the rocks in shades of rose and gold. The wind had died, but the air was heavy with smoke and dust. The man stood with his rifle raised, his breath steady though his hands trembled from the wound in his shoulder. Across from him, the riders spread out in a slow half-circle, their silhouettes dark against the pale morning sky. The woman stood just behind him, one hand clutching a rock, her face set like stone. The whole canyon seemed to hold its breath. The leader's voice came low and harsh. "This is your last chance, stranger. Step aside and you might live to see another sun." The man didn't move. "I've seen enough suns," he said quietly. "You want her, you come and take her." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the echo of boots on stone broke the silence. The first rider stepped forward, his rifle raised. The woman's pulse quickened. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears. Time slowed, every sound sharp. The rattle of a loose pebble, the whisper of wind through the dry grass. Then the man fired. The shot cracked through the stillness like thunder. The first rider fell, his rifle clattering against the rocks. Chaos followed, gunfire echoing through the canyon, smoke curling upward as bullets sparked against stone. The man and the woman ducked behind a boulder, the sharp sting of dust filling their lungs. "They're surrounding us," she shouted. "I know," he called back, reloading. "We hold them here as long as we can." The air filled with noise, men yelling orders, horses screaming, the echo of shots bouncing off the walls. The man fired again, his arm shaking from the blood loss, his vision blurring at the edges. The woman crawled to his side, grabbed the fallen rifle, and without a word began firing too. Her aim was unsteady at first, but she learned fast, the same way she'd learned to survive everything else. When the smoke began to thin, they heard it, a faint whinny from above. A horse, then another. The sound grew louder, closer. The man frowned, confused. "That's not theirs," he whispered. From the upper trail, 3 riders appeared, different from the bounty men, dust-covered, rough, and armed. Traders from the Navajo lands, maybe, or drifters who'd seen too much. They didn't shout or ask questions. They just opened fire from the ridge, aiming at the riders below. The bounty men scattered, caught between 2 sides. For a moment, the world turned into chaos again. The man seized the chance, pulling the woman to her feet. "Now!" he shouted. "Run!" They stumbled up the slope, dodging falling rock and gunfire until the ridge opened up ahead of them. Behind, the shouts faded, the sound of pursuit breaking apart in the confusion. By the time they reached the crest, the sun had climbed high enough to light the valley in full. The man dropped to one knee, gasping for breath, his shoulder soaked in blood. The woman turned, eyes scanning the canyon below. Smoke drifted upward, the last of the fighting lost in distance. "They're gone," she said softly. He nodded, too tired to speak. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it against his wound, her hands gentle but firm. He winced, then managed a faint smile. "You're getting good at this," he murmured. "You saved me more than once," she said. "Now it's my turn." They rested until the heat rose, then began the long walk south. The land stretched endless, rolling red hills, dry riverbeds, distant mountains that shimmered in the sun. The man's pace slowed as his strength faded, but she stayed beside him, steady and unyielding. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It carried a strange peace, the kind that comes only when you've walked through death and found life still waiting. By dusk, they reached a ridge overlooking a green valley. In the distance, small shapes moved, tents, smoke, the faint rhythm of drums. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "That's my people," she whispered. "What's left of them?" The man looked at her, exhaustion and relief mingling on his face. "You made it. We made it," she said softly. He smiled, then stumbled. She caught him before he fell, guiding him to the ground. His breath came shallow now, his face pale. He tried to speak, but she shook her head. "Save your strength." He looked at her, his voice barely a whisper. "You've got to go. They'll take care of you." She pressed his hand to her chest. "Not without you." He tried to protest, but she wouldn't listen. She tore a piece of her blanket and tied it to a branch, waving it high. A figure from the valley below saw it, shouted, and began climbing toward them. Minutes later, 2 men and a woman reached them. They were cautious at first, but when they saw her, their faces softened. One of them recognized her and called her name in their language. She smiled weakly. "He saved me," she said, pointing to the man beside her. "Don't let him die." They nodded, lifting him carefully. The group made their way down the slope, the sound of the drums growing louder. In the camp, the air was warm with the scent of smoke and herbs. They laid the man inside a tent and cleaned his wound, wrapping it tight. The Apache woman stayed by his side, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Hours passed before his eyes opened again. She smiled when she saw him stir. "You're still here," he said faintly. "You think I'd leave you now?" She whispered. Outside, children laughed and elders sang softly by the fire. The night had turned gentle, the stars bright and endless. For the first time in months, she felt something close to peace. Over the next few days, he grew stronger. The people were wary of him at first, but respect came with time. He helped mend fences, fetch water, and fix the old rifles that had survived the raids. He spoke little, but his silence carried weight. The Apache woman often sat with him by the edge of camp, watching the horizon. One evening, as the sky burned orange, she turned to him. "What will you do now?" He looked out at the land, the same land that had taken so much from both of them. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe stay a while. There's work to do here. Maybe the world's still got a use for an old hand like me." She smiled softly. "The land remembers kindness," she said, repeating her old words. "Maybe it brought you here for a reason." He met her gaze, and for a long moment, the silence between them felt like an answer. Days turned into weeks, and the valley healed in small ways. The drums of mourning gave way to songs of rebuilding. The bounty men never returned. Word had spread that the canyon swallowed them whole. Life, fragile but persistent, began again. Sometimes when the night was quiet, the man would stand by the fire and look at the stars. He thought of the past, the war, the loss, the blood spilled in the name of justice, and wondered if this place was his last chance to make peace with it all. And beside him, the Apache woman would sit, weaving strands of grass into small patterns that caught the firelight. They didn't speak much of what happened. Some things, once survived, don't need to be told again. But there was a quiet understanding between them, something born not of words but of shared pain and unspoken trust. As spring came, the land around them turned soft and green again. The river swelled with melted snow. The air smelled of rain and new beginnings. The man often helped the young ones learn how to shoot straight, how to listen to the wind before pulling the trigger. The woman taught them songs of the old days, reminding them of where they came from. One evening, as the sun sank low, she looked at him and said, "When I first came to your village, I thought my life was over. I was wrong. You showed me there's still good in this world," he smiled faintly. "You showed me the same thing." They sat together in the fading light, the land quiet around them. In the distance, a hawk circled high above the canyon, gliding on the wind. The world felt wide again, full of something that had been missing for too long: hope. The man leaned back, his voice soft. "You know, maybe this is what freedom really looks like. Not running, not fighting, just living." She nodded, her eyes on the horizon. And remembering. The night came gentle. The fire crackled low and the stars spread like a promise across the sky. Somewhere beyond the hills, the wind carried the sound of the old world fading away, making room for something new. And there, beneath the endless sky, two souls who had once been enemies sat side by side, no longer fugitives, no longer lost, just people, bound by survival, mercy, and the quiet grace of being alive.